applying to TSA would be very helpful so that there's more of a feeling of fairness in employment action so that hiring decisions and promotion decisions are perceived as fair. Would you agree with that?
Sir, under the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, the Administrator has broad authority to manage the personnel within TSA. All of the authority I need is already in ATSA to do the things that you described, and we are taking steps to be able to do that. One of the things that I mentioned in my opening statement was the conversations I've had with the TSA workforce since I've been the Administrator, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback from them on the things that concern them. I've also met with the American Federation of Government Employees, the Council 100, that represents TSA employees twice now. So I understand their perspective, and we will make significant movement in that regard. Final thing I'd add, sir, is that the Whistleblower Protection Act applies to TSA equally. Even though we're not under Title V, that act applies to TSA employees, as does the Enhancement Act. So I will do whatever I can to ensure that we provide as impartial a personnel review system as we possibly can. That's on my agenda for this fall.
Very good.
Yes, sir. I met with a whole series of whistleblowers a couple months after I came into the position. Very good conversations with each of them. A couple things that came out in those conversations, no surprise to any of us in this room. First and foremost is they had good ideas that we should have listened to. And I really want and I encourage every single employee in TSA, if you have a better way to do our mission or a suggestion as to how we can improve, to please voice it. But we've got to welcome those voices when they're raised. The other thing that the whistleblowers said was that they are totally dedicated to the TSA mission, even after all they went through with respect to retaliation. That speaks volumes to me, to their character. And one of the things that I reflected back to my senior executives after I had those meetings was the fact that we do need to do everything we can to make sure that whistleblowers feel that they can come forward and not be in the category of whistleblowers, but just employees that have a better way of doing something and that we seriously consider it. Additionally, sir, we've trained about 7,000 or 8,000 people in the past year just on whistleblower protection, because I want that word to go out. This is serious business. We do not retaliate. And in fact, we should do something completely different. We should welcome that input into
Let me interrupt you and ask you, how in this training that you're doing, how many
The front lines to screen passengers, baggage, and cargo at our airports, yet are not covered by many of the civil service protections that apply to most other federal employees. In fact, they have far fewer protections than managers do. A recent GAO report found that while TSA and Customs and Border Protection Agency had roughly the same number of employees, TSA had more than double the number of misconduct cases that CBP had in fiscal year 2016. GAO also found that between 2014 and 2016, the number of TSA employees declined, but the number of misconduct cases grew from more than 13,000 to more than 17,000. Administrator, do you have any insight into why these trends have occurred?
And Mr. Cummings, with respect to the data, the 45,000 misconduct cases, part of the reason that number is so high, and I think that number is unacceptably high, let me first state that, is that the way we measured it was a little bit different than the other agencies. So it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison. But what we found when we looked at that data was that we were using misconduct for what were really performance issues. And so what we've done is we've come out with some direction as to how we separate for our employees what's a performance issue versus a misconduct issue, and to not try to use the misconduct avenue when there's truly a performance issue at play. The other thing, sir, that is very important to me, it's in my leadership principles, is I want to move TSA away from a discipline-focused organization where if somebody does something wrong, the first thing we think about is disciplining them, and rather move to a more of a coaching and a mentoring system. My experience with our employees is they want to do a good job. They just sometimes need some extra help in being able to perform, and we should be more coaching and mentoring in that regard.
Well, I see my time has run out, but let me just say this, and the chairman has been very good at this. I think every hearing that we've had, I've heard him say these words, and I agree. I've had good experiences with the TSA employees at the airports and.
The other thing, sir, is that within ATSA, I have the ability to set pay for the workforce, and ATSA gives me the authority to provide what's called in-band increases every year, which is different than Title V General Schedule, which is every 2 or every 3. Unfortunately, we haven't used that authority, and that's something that I'm exploring actively at this point in time. There's also, of course, a financial component to that. But one of the problems we have in TSA right now, particularly at the entry level of the first 2 or 3 pay bands, is that most employees are at the very low end of the pay band. There should be a bell curve there. It shouldn't be everybody at the bottom of the pay band. And so I'm going to work very hard to see if we can't remedy that, at least start moving in a direction, but it is going to require financial resources.
Labor situation, do you have challenges finding TSA workers and retaining them, or is it pretty stable?
Yes, sir. I think the attrition rate, the rate at which we lose people, is still way too high. It's a little bit below 20%, but that's still way too high, and that drives a lot of cost. Cost of recruiting, cost of training new employees, and it also has a security effect because you've got the experience that's just not continuing to be built up. So that's a big concern of mine. The other thing I would just add is that the economy is doing very well in this country, which is a great thing. But it challenges us sometimes, given the wages that we pay for entry-level people, to attract them in some markets around the country. So within the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, I have the ability to put in pay incentives in there, and I have done that, but that comes at some financial cost.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Totally focused on. In fact, when I publish the strategy, when I publish the administrator's intent, if you read those, it's a guidance to the culture that I want to develop within TSA, and based on input I've received from a lot of people.
What is that culture? What are you trying to develop?
I'm trying to develop a culture where we all work together, where we support each other, where different points of view are respected, and we lift each other up and we care for our people. And I want a culture where people look at their employment in TSA and say, hey, I can't wait to get to work today.
And that culture starts at the top.
It does.
What do you personally do to make sure that culture starts at the top?
Yes, sir. What I personally do is, one, I talk about it a lot, and every time I visit TSA men and women almost every single week, sometimes multiple times a week. In fact, I've just gotten back from like a 2.5 week trip throughout TSA, and I want to have that engagement with our employees so I can reinforce those messages, and also, very importantly, get a sense for how it's going out there. And when I meet with employees, I don't just meet with them in a big group. I walk around the checkpoint and I talk with people person to person, because it's only during those encounters really that you're going to get some feedback that's of particular value. And so I want to ensure that I don't lose touch with the workforce, and I also want the workforce to know that I work for them. My job is to make sure that they have
servant leadership.
Yes, absolutely. That they have the tools and the direction and the support, and importantly, when something happens that lands a transportation security officer or a federal air marshal in the news, if they followed our procedures, I need to be right behind them and be out in front, and we have done that. So, I think that's a very strong message, and that's certainly what I'll continue. I've done it for, this has been the way I've worked for 40 years.